Hello, 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 and welcome once again to CorpusCast, the podcast from Aston University about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society. I'm your host, Dr. Robbie Love, and today we're tackling an important methodological topic in corpus linguistics, namely representativeness, a bit of a mouthful, I know. For the findings from corpus research to mean anything, we need to ensure that the corpus we use is designed appropriately to sample the type or types of language that we're looking at. But how can we tell a well-designed corpus apart from a not so well-designed one? What are the main considerations researchers should make when either building a new corpus from scratch or indeed using one of the many existing ones that you can find readily available? To tell me more about this quite meaty topic in corpus linguistics related to corpus design, representativeness, is my guest today, Dr. Bethany Gray, Professor of Applied Linguistics and Technology in the Department of English at Iowa State University. Bethany is very well qualified to talk about this issue. She has a wealth of experience as a researcher and teacher in corpus linguistics, text analysis, discourse analysis, disciplinary variation in academic writing, L1 and L2 academic writing development, English for academic purposes, synchronic and diachronic register variation, English grammar and grammatical complexity, just to name a few of her many research interests. And of particular relevance to today's topic of representativeness is Bethany's book, Designing and Evaluating Language Corpora, co-authored with a previous CorpusCast guest, Jesse Egbert, and their colleague, Doug Byburn. It was published just a couple of years ago in 2022. I'll be asking Bethany all about this issue of representativeness. So without further ado, please welcome to CorpusCast today's guest, Bethany Gray. Hello, Bethany. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Robbie.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm really grateful that you agreed to come on to join us in this episode of CorpusCast. We'll dive right in with the question I always start with at the beginning of every conversation, and that is, what does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Okay. Well, I have to admit that I've watched a lot of the CorpusCast episodes, and so you might not hear much new from me in terms of how I conceptualize corpus linguistics. For me, it is a set of research methods that we can use to uncover empirical language patterns and empirical information about language variation. And importantly, we're doing this in natural language use, so that language that humans really produce during their everyday lives. And in particular, what I view corpus linguistics as contributing is this pairing of quantitative data with sort of meaningful functional analysis. By pairing the quantitative data and the interpretations and functions, we're able to better explain why the language choices that people make occur, why register variation occurs, and so on. And so that's what I really love about corpus linguistics, because there are very few research methods that allow you to pair that quantitative data and the functional analysis all from the same data set.
Now, I'm always curious when people, as you just said, what I love about corpus linguistics, and I sometimes find myself saying similar things. It's not something that somebody is born into necessarily, kind of like, oh, I'm going to be a corpus linguist. So tell me a bit about how you became somebody who loves corpus linguistics. Where in your life did that happen? When did you become interested in the study of language? And just give us a sense of, I suppose, your academic background and your career, and how you came to be this person who loves corpus linguistics as you do.
Yeah. So I think I was always fascinated by language. I can remember, I was that one kid in grade school when we got to sentence diagramming in the language arts class. I was just happy as could be. But I think I really fell in love with language when I got to high school and started learning Spanish. And at first, it didn't go well, I'll be honest. In fact, in my first kind of semester of high school Spanish, I earned my very first B+.
Oh. Oh.
I was devastated.
Okay, so a B plus is bad. Okay.
Okay, yes. Well, relatively. It's not the top mark.
Yeah. Okay.
But it wasn't long after that I really started noticing patterns in the language and really started to pick things up. And so I grew up in a small rural town in Iowa with a very small high school. In fact, I was only one of 2 students who made it all the way to Spanish 4. So the 4th year of Spanish. And our teacher said, well, there's only 2 of you, just pick a project for your kind of final capstone project. And I chose to write a grammar of Spanish.
An entire grammar of
Spanish. Oh, it was terrible. It was rather ill-informed, but it represented what I knew about language and my kind of fascination with trying to systematize and document the structure of a language. And I carried that with me when I went to Iowa State University to do my undergraduate degree. I kind of started out in linguistics. Then I fell into this trap, everybody's saying, oh, what are you going to do with that degree? Ended up changing my major to journalism, took a half a semester of journalism classes. I was like, this is not for me. The tight timelines, it just wasn't for me. And so I switched back to linguistics. And it was during that undergraduate degree that I started taking courses with the faculty at Iowa State. And there were a few courses that really kind of set me on this path towards corpus linguistics. First was a class in linguistic anthropology, where I got to go back to that idea of writing a grammar, but this time it was for Turkish, and it was based on kind of expert informants who would come and we would do kind of language documentation tasks with these Turkish speakers. Then I took sociolinguistics with Dr. John Levis and learned about language variation and how to empirically study language variation. Then I took a grammatical analysis course with Dr. Viviana Cortez, who was then kind of a newly minted assistant professor at Iowa State. And that's where I discovered corpus linguistics. And I really got to kind of pair this love of grammar with the idea of the systematic investigation of grammar and of grammatical variation. I did my first corpus-based study in that class. This was back in the days of, I used Monoconc as my first concordancer. I still love that program. I actually still use it sometimes. But this idea of taking an interest in language structure and being able to go out and find empirical data that would answer my hypotheses was something that just really hit home for me. So my first project was, taking a piece of prescriptive language advice and then going and seeing how published writers really used that feature. And spoiler alert, it wasn't really what the prescriptivism said it should be. So that really fed my interest in saying, hey, I want to know what people really do, not what people say we should do or what people think we do. And so that's why the empirical nature of corpus linguistics really appealed to me.
Okay, and you ended up doing your PhD at Northern Arizona, right?
Yeah, so after my undergrad, I continued on to a master's in teaching English as a second language and applied linguistics again at Iowa State. And when I finished that degree, Viviana Cortez said, you have to go to NAU, you have to go to Northern Arizona and study with Doug Biber and Randy Reppin and join that corpus community there. So we moved from Iowa to Flagstaff and spent the next 5 years there really working closely with Doug, with Randy, as well as a whole cohort of NAU alumni. Susan Conrad became a big influence of my work because of her work on disciplinary writing, and because of that network of corpus scholars at NAU and alumni of NAU, and even the upcoming scholars. I developed a lot of relationships with other corpus linguists who were kind of developing at the same time as me, So, working closely with Jesse Egbert and Shelley Staples, Eric Friginal and Jack Grieve, it was just an amazing place to kind of develop as a researcher.
And so it's nice you mentioned actually that a few previous CorpusCast guests there as well from that cohort, which is wonderful to hear. That there are a million things that I wish I had time to ask you about, because you've done so many different things in your research. But we're focusing, as you know, on this concept of representativeness. And of course, as you returned back to Iowa State and have had your academic career and published in a wide range of different topics, mostly, if not all, using corpus methods in some way. You've been involved with designing and building your own corpora, for instance, of academic writing, among others. And then more recently, published with Jesse and Doug, as you mentioned, this book that sort of tries to bring together all these ideas in designing and evaluating corpora. So let's dive into representativeness, and let's assume that this is a term that we've never heard before. What would be your go-to kind of accessible definition, if there is one, for representativeness when it comes to designing or evaluating a corpus?
Yeah. So this seems like a very simple question, Robbie.
I know it's not.
As the book will attest, in the 6-7 years it took us to write the book, will attest, it's actually a fairly disputed concept. If I were to kind of boil it down to how I view it, I view representativeness as the ability to generalize from the corpus to the real world. So when we analyze a corpus, we're analyzing patterns of use. We're identifying what are trends, what are probabilistic trends, what are functional trends, why do those things occur? And to me, representativeness boils down to, is what we see in the corpus what's really happening out there in the real world? And so that ability to believe that what we're finding from the corpus reflects some actual truth in the world.
Now, when you put it like that, it does actually sound quite, a simple enough idea and not too controversial. But as you said, as you discovered in writing your book, it's not something that there has been a sort of standard agreed approach to. What are some of the, I suppose, the dominant kind of traditional approaches, or not, as I suspect the case may be in some cases, just not really addressing it. What are sort of the kind of traditional sort of approaches that have kind of been a hallmark of kind of earlier research in the field, or the most influential kind of approaches that there have been so traditionally in the field?
Yeah. So we spent quite a bit of time actually delving into that literature, and Jesse especially spent a lot of time and effort on this. And we actually identified sort of 11 distinct or different conceptualizations or ways that representativeness had been talked about. And this includes corpus linguistics research, but it also considers research in statistics, social science, sampling methods, and things like that. And they really run a whole gamut from, I think probably one of the most common, which is sort of what we call general acclaim. So that's like a researcher saying, I used this representative corpus of X. Right. And so there's this blanket claim that of course it's representative, to things that as long as it's large enough, it's fine, it's representative, to all the way to representativeness is never possible, and so we don't need to worry about it too much. And I think that those are, I chose those as maybe the three kind of least productive. I'm very much a pragmatist, and so I want to be able to do something with any concept. And those, I think, kind of limit us in thinking about what representativeness means and how we can maximize it. Other conceptualizations, I think, have more for us to work with. So these include things like representativeness is when the corpus covers the full range of variation that exists in the full population or the domain that we are sampling from. or that it permits good estimation. So if we're measuring something, that the corpus is representative if it allows us to provide good estimates of what we're measuring. Others that deal with kind of sampling and random sampling. Is a corpus a sample that has an absence of selective forces? So it's not that we're prioritizing some text, but rather it's pretty random in terms of what got included. And there are several others that offer kind of pieces of the whole representativeness picture that we can actually work with as corpus linguists and try to develop corpora that are more representative of the domain we want to learn about.
So, okay, now we're starting to get into it. It is becoming more evident that there is quite a lot of complexity here. Why? There's so many things I want to ask, and I'll probably ask them all eventually. But I'll start with, I certainly have seen this as well in my reading. This kind of gung ho approach to, oh, it doesn't matter, it's the corpus is big enough, or I'm just going to assert that it's representative because the person who built it told me it was, right? And I think that's probably quite common too. Sort of just putting the faith, if it's not a corpus you design yourself, but a publicly accessible one that you've accessed via an interface, just sort of, well, it's been made available, it must be perfect, right? Mm-hmm. But some of these seem sort of fundamentally kind of really, big issues that are of real sort of significance in terms of how they affect the research. And so what is it about language that lends itself to people not necessarily conceiving of it in a way that makes sense for building a corpus, as in this idea that we're sampling something and therefore the sample needs to represent the bigger entity that we're sampling from? I feel like if we were talking about something a bit more concrete, then there's no way that we'd see so much variation in terms of the extent to which people pay attention or, to this issue. But is it because language is abstract that it's maybe easier to just kind of go, well, I've got my data set and I'm going to talk about what's in my data and therefore it's good research? What do you think it is that has sort of lent itself to there being such a variety of approaches that, seem to pay more or less attention to this issue?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is kind of the nature of the language domain, which is that it's actually really hard. It's harder for some registers and easier for others. It's actually hard to think about, well, to define what is the actual full population. Maybe you could come up with a list of every fiction book that ever existed from the years 2010 to 2020, but my guess is that's actually a fairly hard task to do. And so because the domains that we're interested in are so big, and they have a lot of internal variation, and it's not like one text necessarily fits into one box. Oh, this text is a conversation. Sometimes they do, but a lot of times they don't. And so the task of actually defining the population that we're interested in is challenging in and of itself. And that's really the first step to build a good sample, is to understand, well, what is it that I'm trying to represent?
Yeah, and I think that is a really good point, in that some domains are not necessarily even just difficult, but actually impossible. Mm-hmm. I promise that I must stop talking about the British National Corpus at some point in my career, but here we go again. I'm a one-hit wonder, but it was a good hit, so that's fine. When you're building a spoken corpus, and the Lana team, of course, Northern Arizona and Lancaster, I know you're very familiar with what's happening there, and they will have the same issue, I'm sure, at the moment in compiling Lana, where you're trying to sample casual conversation among a really big population of an entire country. You cannot make a list of every conversation that has ever taken place in private in one block of buildings, let alone an entire country of millions and millions of people. So how on earth do you do it? And I think one of the approaches you mentioned there is interesting, looking at not just the kind of, I suppose, external variability of sort of text types, but rather that have you got the range of linguistic variation that you need? And this might be a naive question, but I'll ask it anyway, because I think it's a really interesting idea around evaluating the linguistic representativeness. But it's a bit sort of a potentially cyclical, I guess. And if you are doing a study where you're seeking to describe for the first time a domain of language, how do you know that you have the full range? You know, how can you tell when you've got the range of variability that you need if you don't have any reference to compare against? You know, how do you know when you've got what you need if you're defining representativeness from a linguistic perspective?
Yeah, and I think that there's kind of two, maybe three kind of main types of corpora. There is that type of corpora where you can define the domain first, and then build a sample that you think reflects that domain. In other cases, you don't really have a good sense of what the domain is. And so sometimes the approach, I think Doug and Jesse did this in their Web Registers book, where there wasn't a cohesive kind of domain description. So instead what they did was they sampled very widely and broadly, and then kind of analyzed the sample to determine kind of what are those major categories within the domain. Then there's another, type of corpus, which this is common when we're talking about learner corpora or student writing corpora, probably even the conversation corpora, where you're relying on people to give you their text, to contribute to the corpus, where you have relatively little control over the sampling, right? Because it's what you happen to get. And we can do things like advertise or recruit from certain populations or varieties. But in the end, we don't necessarily have a lot of control over it. And so those three different types of corpora, I think, require sort of different ways of thinking about representativeness and maybe different practical steps in terms of putting the collected text together into a corpus.
I see. So it really does depend, I think, is the impression I'm getting, that maybe part of the answer as to why there've been so many different approaches is that there isn't necessarily one single approach that applies in every context. I want to sort of carry on the design aspect for now briefly, and then I do want to ask you about this distinction obviously between designing and building your own corpus and then looking for data that's already there and taking a corpus that someone else has already made and applying the same sorts of principles to evaluate the suitability of that corpus. So we will turn to that in a moment, but maybe if you're happy to sort of talk us through maybe an example, and this could be an example that we just kind of make up on the spot, sort of hypothetically, or if you do have a specific example from a corpus you've actually built for a study, then obviously that would be great as well. But let's say with academic writing, I know this is something you've done a lot of work in this area of academic writing, student writing, and let's say that you're starting a new study and you decide you need to build a new corpus, and in this case it is to an extent opportunistic. What are the things that you can control, and what are the sort of main principles that you recommend in terms of getting a handle on representativeness as best as you can when going about designing a corpus like that?
Yeah, and this is exactly what we wanted to achieve with the book. Many of the conceptualizations of representativeness are very much conceptual and theoretical. And then you go to the actual research, and there's not much discussion of representative because we haven't bridged that gap between the ideals of representativeness and what corpus linguists actually do. And so really the motivation of the book was providing a practical framework that can help us bridge that. And so we kind of divide the book into sort of, or the process of building a corpus into two considerations. One is what we call domain considerations. And this refers to whether the extent to which your corpus contains the full range of texts that exist in whatever population you're trying to represent. And this isn't a new concept, it's a new term. But scholars like Doug Biber and Tony McEnery have used terms like external representativeness or situational representativeness. The second step is what we call distribution considerations. And this is where we're looking at to what extent does the corpus allow us to make these accurate quantitative findings that generalize to the domain. And so the framework that we have kind of leads you through the steps to first consider the domain considerations, and then move on to distribution considerations. So the very first step of considering domain considerations is what we call domain description. And so the method is you use a collection of methods, hopefully ones that go beyond just what you already know about the domain, looking at a whole range of sources of information. So to give an example from the academic writing corpora that I've collected in the past, this involves saying, okay, well, how are disciplines divided up? What's the nature of disciplines? What are the boundaries of disciplines? One of the things that we want to be able to do, one of the first tasks we need to be able to do is we need to be able to look at a text and say, does this belong in my domain or not? And so we call this, looking for the external boundaries of the domain. We then also need to consider the variation within the domain. So what are all of the text types or the possible variables that might lead to variation within the domain that my corpus could account for? And in academic writing, I have used a range of methods, including kind of scholarly research. Almost every discipline has research that talks about the nature of the discipline. Things like national organizations. If you think about ours, like TESOL or AAAL, they have strands, and those strands represent variation within the field. I've used expert informants, actually going to people in those disciplines, and that's particularly important. I can design a corpus for applied linguistics because I have some insider knowledge, but you tell me I need to build a corpus of chemistry articles, and I'm really going to need some support from someone who really knows the field. We've also done things like extensive analyses of texts. So I during my PhD, I spent a solid 3 weeks at the library because this was prior to everything being online. Thumbing through journals and all these different disciplines to try and figure out, what is the nature, what kinds of texts are there. Once you have that description of the whole domain, right? This is the ideal. This is what really is out there in the world. Then you can turn to the second step, which is operationalizing the domain. And this is where we start to get practical, where we say, okay, what text could I actually include in the corpus? These are, these steps include things like identifying what, for an academic writing example, identifying what journals could I sample from. And again, this might have some practical constraints, like what do you have legal access to through the institution's library? Many people use things like impact factors to make sure that it's a good journal. I personally have gone to expert informants and said, okay, here's a list of journals that I think represent kind of the range of research in this field. Is there anything missing? Are any of these not well respected? So there's a lot of kind of triangulation that goes on in both the domain description stage, but also in the operationalizing. It's during this operationalizing the domain where we want to pause and evaluate and say, okay, here's my full domain. Here's what I imagine could be my practical operational domain. What are the strengths and what are the limitations? So no corpus is going to be perfectly representative unless we can do 100% sample. So the question is not, is it a perfect sample? The question is, what are the strengths and weaknesses? What can I make claims about and what can I not make claims about?
I see. Go ahead.
Oh, and then you can actually plan and design the sample. So design if there are going to be subcorpora or strata. So for example, in mine, I identified research paradigm as a major parameter of variation. If you read an applied linguistics qualitative article versus a quantitative research methods article, they're very different linguistically. And so for me, that was a strata that was important to make sure that I represent. Then we move on to actually defining the sampling unit. What exactly am I going to collect? And also the sampling method. Will it be some form of random sampling? Will it be a snowball sample? And there are a whole range of options that allow us to, go beyond a simple convenience sample to something that is principled and planned to maximize representativeness.
Now, it certainly seems that from what we've discussed, that there'll be a lot of sort of corpora that have been built that probably haven't thought about these, or the compilers of which probably haven't thought about these issues to this extent, haven't operationalized the domain in this way, for instance. And I suppose maybe an obvious curiosity is I'm wondering your thoughts on, are there, is there research that has been done, whether recently or longer ago, the findings from which you would sort of question on the basis of the data is maybe not actually properly representative? I'm not asking you to sort of, drop anyone in it or name names, but logically, this, if these issues that you put forward and the recommendations are clearly, maximizing, good science, right? Then without taking these considerations into account, it suggests that maybe there's so-called bad science going on. Is that, to what extent are you concerned about that in terms of the research that appears not to have thought about these issues to this extent?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to point out any particular.
No, of course.
I would say that I think it is a concern. And I think what I see more often, I follow some corpus linguistics groups on social media, and you often see kind of novice researchers saying, I have these texts. And so it's not actually that they don't do the operationalizing the domain stage. It's that they only do the operationalizing the domain. So they don't have a good sense of what the full domain is. They say, hey, look, I have access to these texts. I'm going to turn them into a corpus. And that, that's kind of a phrasing that I've heard frequently, especially from novice researchers, where we're not really thinking about what it is that we want to represent. Instead, we go directly to what we have. And that is, I think, one of the major, a limitation of that is in those cases, I think what we're describing is what we have, not necessarily some bigger idea of what it is that we want to describe out there in the real world.
And I suppose often if researchers are going to choose to use an existing corpus as opposed to taking data that they gather themselves, a lot of the, more often than not, the publicly accessible corpora design is these quite large general corpora, whether it's massive web scrape corpora that you find in Sketch Engine that are billions of words, or national samples of entire national varieties, things like that. I suppose the question is, similarly, they may have been built under differing conceptions of representativeness and differing standards of representativeness across, long periods of time in different teams of researchers, etc. It's two questions really. From a researcher perspective who's got a question they want to ask of some data, and they think that they don't need to build their own corpus because there's a corpus already there that they think may be able to answer their question. What are the things that we should be doing to help us decide whether indeed that corpus is suitable from a representativeness perspective? Is it about finding, and hopefully there's some good rigorous documentation that the compilers have prepared, for instance, and that's something that I think is really important. And or are there other things that you recommend that researchers should do to evaluate corpora that other people have built?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's probably a question that more corpus researchers face than the other question of how do I design one. I mean, after all, one of the major strengths of corpora is that they're often reusable, that we can use one corpus to answer multiple research questions. And there are kind of 2 points. I mean, one is that in the book we consider representativeness. We have these domain considerations, and then we have a second set of considerations called distribution considerations. But both of them are completely relevant or relative to what research question you want to ask. So a corpus could have been a well-designed, principled corpus that is able to answer certain research questions, and then it gets applied to a different research question, and all of a sudden it's not as good at answering those questions. And so for me, in choosing an existing corpus, the question comes back to the domain. So before you even start thinking about what corpus to use, I think we need to think about the domain. What domain do I want to learn about? And then once you have that domain defined, describing the domain, et cetera, and so on, then you can say, here's an existing corpus. That corpus documentation is key. How was it designed? What does it actually contain? Really looking at the documentation in terms of what the strata are, what the sampling methods were, what the composition of the different strata are. You can do that same comparison of the sample to the domain with an existing corpus, as long as the corpus builders have provided the documentation that you need to do that. But the other is that these distribution considerations, and the distribution considerations are very much related to corpus size. So if I were to really boil it down, it's a question of whether the corpus is large enough to enable these accurate quantitative patterns that really reflect what's happening. And once you have a corpus, we actually do have methods that you can use to evaluate whether that corpus is addressing the distribution considerations. And there's a whole chapter in the book actually of, relatively simple statistical techniques that we can do to say, okay, here's the research question I want to ask about this existing corpus. Okay, I've already evaluated that it matches my domain considerations. Now I can actually do some pilot analyses and determine, does it also address my distribution considerations? And so that kind of piloting and understanding what the existing corpus contains will allow you to make a good evaluation of what you could use for your research.
I'm sure that as helpful as these recommendations are and have been for me, they'll also be very, very useful to our listeners as well. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and recommendations on this. I want to sort of start to wrap up our conversation. The time flies so quickly. It always does. And I think it's sort of makes sense that in our quick questions section, I'm going to ask you some methods related questions too, in terms of the state of the field. And there's a million things I want to ask, because I think things are changing, increasingly quickly in terms of the accessibility and the status of corpus linguistics and who is getting interested, involved in corpus linguistics. So I want to start by asking you, do you think that research in corpus linguistics is living up to its potential?
So in many ways, I think yes. We've seen an influx in the availability of corpora. It's getting easier to build corpora. Sometimes it's a little too easy, and it's a little too easy to sidestep kind of the principled design stage. But we're seeing, a wider range of corpus studies. We're able to investigate more linguistic phenomenon. We're able to investigate more registers or text types or genres, whatever you want to call kind of text varieties. And that understanding of kind of the full nature of language expands every day. we're seeing really good growth in the applications of corpus methods to language teaching and language pedagogy, all the way to impacts on legal. I mean, corpus linguists are making it to the Supreme Court with their briefs. Some of your previous guests have talked about that. But, you know, there's also in Washington, D.C., there's a new museum called Planet Word. And it's a museum just about language, and they have a whole display on corpus linguistics. And so we're beginning to, you know, reach outside of the circle of academia into kind of public awareness. And I think that will continue to grow. At the same time, I also see ways that we can, you know, have more responsible contributions. So there's been a huge focus on just really, really large data sets without a lot of principled design behind them. You know, that's what's happening with a lot of the large language models and what's going into those AI-based systems that are feeding into generative AI. And I think we have the potential there to show, okay, what is the importance of what the training data for these large language models are? To me, it comes down to corpus representativeness.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's lots of potential for us to grow in those ways as well.
And that, I think, is crucial as, you know, generative AI, chatbots, ChatGPT, etc., becomes apparently, you know, and very quickly much more central to so much of what we're doing. But I imagine that's going to be quite a difficult task when so much of this data and the methods are proprietary in that, you know, they're hidden, you know, in commercially sensitive projects, essentially. How, you know, I think that's a very interesting question in terms of how do you try and get in there into the room and influence those sorts of practices, apart from going and working for them, of course. That's one way. Similar, I suppose, related to that, I'll ask another question, which is looking ahead. What might corpus research look like, say, 50 years in the future?
That's a good question. I'm probably not very well qualified to make predictions. I think that there's a lot of, you know, things in flux. In some ways, it may represent, you know, greater accessibility of some of the methods of corpus linguistics, similar to, you know, the greater accessibility that occurred earlier in the field's history when we started to get more and more kind of off-the-shelf corpus analysis software, right? Where the researcher didn't necessarily have to be able to program or do complicated statistics because they had software that was off the shelf that could help them. You know, that is great in terms of increasing access to the method and expanding on what we do with corpus linguistics, but it also has some inherent dangers, which is that the user still needs to have enough information to use those tools responsibly. I actually just saw an article, not published in a linguistics journal, actually. It was a non-linguistics journal, but it was how AI can help us carry out language analysis for non-linguists.
Okay.
I think it was actually a psychology journal. And that's great, but we as linguists still need to be able to do that. These AI-based tools require human supervision in order to validate the results, to use the results responsibly, to use the methods responsibly. And so I think a major challenge for us going forward is to make sure that our corpus linguists have enough training to be able to use those tools in ways that are meaningful.
I couldn't agree more, and certainly something that I've been feeling recently as well, as we start to see the influx of journal articles evaluating, you know, to what extent ChatGPT and similar tools can do the manual bits of, you know, corpus discourse analysis, for instance, for us, and you know, linguistics clearly needs to remain at the heart of what we do. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but I couldn't agree more. Bethany, thank you so much. We're going to wrap things up there. And yeah, I just want to thank you. This has been a bit of a meaty topic, and really appreciate your willingness to dive in a relatively short sort of format to tease apart some of the main principles of representativeness, because you've very clearly demonstrated how crucial it is to be aware of these issues. And I think for me particularly, in terms of accessing existing corpora, which is something that a lot of people are doing, there's probably a lot more people are doing that more often than they are building their own data sets. So I think for those who do build a corpus and release it publicly, I think there is responsibility there to be transparent about the process behind that. So I think that's a really good takeaway. So yes, thank you. And thank you to our viewers and listeners. That's it for this episode of CorpusCast. Thanks for joining us once again. However it is you view us, whether that's on YouTube or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. In the meantime, do let us know your thoughts using the hashtag CorpusCast. Make sure to check out the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group on X at Aston Corpus, and you can follow me at Lovermob. CorpusCast is an Aston Originals podcast hosted by me, Robbie Love, and produced by Sam Cook. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon on the next episode of CorpusCast. And thanks once again to today's guest, Bethany Gray. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.